Imagine sitting at the dinner table with your family, the people you've trusted your entire life. The conversation flows like any other night, laughter, memories, and a shared sense of comfort. And then, out of nowhere, someone says something so disturbing, so unbelievably dark, that it freezes time. Your heart drops. Your skin goes cold. And suddenly, everything you thought you knew about this person shatters. That's exactly what happened in this story, and trust me, you won't believe what came out of this young man's mouth that left his family frozen in fear. Welcome to a real-life nightmare, a true crime unraveling in the heart of suburban America, where a single confession would tear a family apart and trigger a police investigation that shocked the nation.
Hey, I see you.
You're here for the truth, for the shocking admission, the sinister secret, and the one answer that's been bothering you since you read the title. You want to know what he said? You want to understand why a seemingly normal son would reveal something so horrifying that it left his mother speechless and his father in tears. And I promise you'll get that answer. But to truly understand the magnitude of this moment, we have to go back to where it all began. And together, we're going to peel back the layers, step by step. I'm not just here to tell you a story. I'm here to take you into it. You're going to feel what the family felt.
See what they saw.
And when the final piece clicks into place, you'll realize the monster didn't come from outside. He was already at the table. This story isn't just about crime. It's about psychology. It's about how evil can hide behind the smile of someone you raised, how manipulation festers in the silence of unchecked trauma, and how families sometimes become the breeding ground for darkness. If you've ever thought you truly knew someone, if you've ever believed your child could never, ever be capable of something so horrifying, this case will shake that belief to the core. And as you watch, ask yourself, would I have seen the signs? Could I have stopped it? Or would I, too, have been blindsided by a chilling confession that came too late? Now, before we go deeper, I want you to make a commitment with me. Stay with me through this entire story. Don't just skip to the twist. Don't fast forward to the reveal. Because every second you spend here is a piece of the puzzle. And believe me, this puzzle gets darker with every turn. The most chilling part? The family didn't just miss the signs, they ignored them. Out of love, out of hope, out of fear. And by the time they finally opened their eyes, it was too late. You deserve to hear the full story. You owe it to yourself to know how a family's silence paved the way for something so unspeakable, it shook an entire community. Let's talk about the Martins, a middle-class family in upstate New York. Quiet neighborhood, big lawn, two-story home with the porch light always on. The kind of place where neighbors wave at each other every morning and where kids ride bikes until the streetlights come on. Peter Martin, the father, worked in finance. Steady job, kept to himself, loved his routines. His wife, Elaine, was a former nurse turned homemaker. The kind of woman who baked cookies for the block and never missed a parent-teacher conference. And then there was their son, Caleb, the boy who was always just a little too quiet, a little too withdrawn, but smart, polite, respectful. At least, that's what everyone thought. Caleb was 22 when he made the confession, but the signs, those subtle cracks in his mask, had been there for years. The problem? No one wanted to see them. The family, wrapped in denial, brushed them off as teenage mood swings or stress from school. But underneath that calm surface, something much more dangerous was brewing. Something methodical, calculated, and deeply disturbing. His classmates described him as distant. His teachers said he was brilliant, but emotionally detached. And his parents? They thought he just needed time. Maybe therapy. Maybe love. What they didn't realize was that their son was rehearsing a truth he'd eventually reveal in the most devastating way imaginable. Let me ask you something. Have you ever seen a child lie so convincingly that you almost believe them over your own instincts? That's the trap Elaine and Peter fell into. And by the time Caleb dropped the bombshell that would rip through the very foundation of their family, there was no turning back. What did he say exactly? What could possibly be so dark that his own mother recoiled in horror and whispered, "No, please no"? That's the part that'll make your stomach drop. Because it wasn't just a confession, It was a calculated move, a test, a power play, and it would launch an investigation that would uncover something much bigger than anyone ever expected. Right now, trending true crime searches on YouTube are filled with stories of hidden psychopaths, chilling confessions, and families' secrets exposed. This case? It checks all those boxes and then some. It's the kind of story that makes you double-check your front door at night and stare a little longer at the people you love. Not out of suspicion, but out of fear that you might have missed something. A look, a moment, a sentence that, if caught earlier, might have changed everything. So, as we dive deeper, I want you to keep your eyes wide open. Watch how the truth unravels. How Caleb slowly begins to show his true face. How investigators, once they're called in, begin to piece together a story that's even more terrifying than the confession itself. Because what Caleb admitted at that dinner table, it was only the beginning. The true horror would only come to light once detectives started digging. And what they found, it made national headlines, sent shockwaves through the criminal justice system, and forced every parent watching the news to ask themselves, do I really know my child? You're going to hear from investigators, neighbors, and even friends who once defended him until they couldn't anymore. You're going to walk through crime scenes, examine digital evidence, and uncover chilling diary entries that reveal a darkness far deeper than anyone could have imagined. But before we go there, before we peel back the next layer, I have to warn you, what happens next is not easy to hear. And it's definitely not easy. Caleb Martin had always been something of an enigma, even to those closest to him. To an outsider, he was just another quiet kid from a good home, someone who kept to himself but never made trouble. In his small community, where everyone knew everyone else's business, Caleb was what most people would describe as a little off but harmless. His mother, Elaine, often brushed off his isolation as introversion. His father, Peter, chalked it up to stress from college. But if you looked a little closer, if you watched the way his eyes darted during conversation, the way he flinched at casual touch, or how he always seemed to be observing rather than participating, you might sense that something wasn't quite right. Caleb had spent the last few months before his confession in a sort of limbo. He'd dropped out of college unexpectedly, telling his parents he needed time to figure things out. But the truth was, he hadn't been going to classes for nearly a semester before they found out. And while he claimed he was looking for work, no one ever saw him leave the house with a resume, nor did they hear back from any of the supposed jobs he applied for. And that's where the questions really started. Neighbors began to wonder what Caleb was doing down there all day. Some speculated he was gaming. He spent most of his time in the basement, headphones on, computer screen glowing, whispering conversations no one else could hear. Others thought he might be into something darker. One man down the street, Mr. Halvorsen, a retired military vet, noted that he once caught Caleb digging in the woods behind the neighborhood, close to midnight, with what looked like a shovel. He said it was for planting something, the man recounted, but I've been around long enough to know the difference between gardening and hiding. Elaine brushed that story off too, saying her son had always loved nature, even as a boy. She smiled politely, defended Caleb as sensitive, thoughtful, and too smart for his own good. But the more she spoke in his defense, the more people began to feel like she didn't really believe it herself. There were also whispers at the local library, where Caleb used to frequent in high school. A librarian remembered seeing him back just weeks before the confession, hunched over books about criminal psychology and forensic science. Nothing illegal about that, of course. But when paired with the chilling things he would soon reveal, it all took on a new, unsettling tone. She mentioned how he didn't just borrow those books. He studied them, took notes, sometimes stared at the pages long after he'd finished reading. When asked what he was researching, he'd shrug and say, "Just curious. I like learning about what makes people snap." At the time, it seemed like harmless intellectual curiosity. In hindsight, it sounded more like premeditation. Then there were the relationships, or the lack thereof. Caleb never had close friends. He had acquaintances, classmates, people who invited him to parties once or twice before realizing he was the kind of guy who just stood in the corner, watching. There was one girl, though. Her name was Jenna. She'd known Caleb since middle school and had once tried to date him. They lasted all of 3 weeks before she broke it off, saying he was too intense. She told her friends that Caleb had this way of saying things that felt too personal, too invasive, like he knew more about her than he should. One night, he even showed up outside her house unannounced. Just stood there in the driveway. Didn't knock. Didn't text. Just stared at her window for 10 solid minutes before walking away. That incident never made it to the police. Jenna's parents assumed it was just heartbreak. But she never spoke to Caleb again. What made this case all the more disturbing and kept everyone in town on edge was that Caleb didn't look the part. He wasn't aggressive. He didn't have a criminal record. He wasn't the guy you'd cross the street to avoid. He was articulate,
Calm.
polite, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and held the door open for strangers. And maybe that's why his confession hit so hard. Because when someone like that says something unspeakable, it forces you to rethink everything. That maybe evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it whispers from behind a familiar smile. As investigators started digging into his background, more unsettling details emerged. Caleb had been active in online forums, one centered around violent fiction, morbid curiosity, and dark psychology. He used aliases, interacted with others who shared his obsession with power, manipulation, and domination. One screen name, in particular, kept coming up: Mind Architect 21. Under that name, he had posted lengthy essays on how to control people emotionally, how to lie convincingly, and how to erase empathy. Disturbing stuff. And while none of it was technically illegal, it painted a chilling portrait of someone who wasn't just curious, he was practicing, refining, preparing. That's when the detectives started considering other possibilities. Could Caleb have already acted on his impulses? Was the confession just the tip of something deeper, something buried, both figuratively and maybe literally? And that brings us to the red herrings. Because as the police started questioning people, other names started surfacing. Caleb's older cousin, Daniel, had a criminal history and was known for getting into fights. Some wondered if Daniel had influenced Caleb, or worse, coerced him into something dark. Then there was their neighbor, Mrs. Carlyle, who had her own secrets, a reclusive woman with a history of psychiatric breakdowns and a fixation on true crime. Could she have planted ideas in Caleb's head? Some locals even began speculating about Peter himself, Caleb's father, who had once been accused of workplace harassment that mysteriously never made it to court. Was the darkness in Caleb inherited, taught, or born from something even more insidious? The deeper detectives looked, the more tangled the web became. Each potential suspect brought a new layer of confusion, of possibility. Was Caleb the lone architect of something truly horrific? Or was he just one part of a much larger, more sinister picture? Everyone had a theory. Everyone had a suspicion. But the truth remained just out of reach. And Caleb? He wasn't saying another word. Not to his parents. Not to the police. Not to anyone. One thing, however, was certain. His confession wasn't spontaneous. It was planned, rehearsed, delivered like a performance. And if someone goes that far to craft a moment like that, what else have they been crafting behind closed doors? Because while the family thought the worst part was hearing what Caleb had done, they didn't realize the most terrifying part was what he hadn't told them yet. And what detectives would soon uncover, buried in that basement, would change everything. The deeper detectives pushed into Caleb Martin's world, the more resistance they began to face, subtle at first, then unmistakably deliberate. Just days after his confession, the primary investigator, Detective Laura Hastings, received word that one of Caleb's hard drives, the one he supposedly kept hidden in a locked drawer in his basement, had gone missing. The drawer was still locked. No signs of forced entry. The only other person with access to the key was Peter, Caleb's father, and he swore he hadn't touched anything. But the timeline didn't add up. According to the lab technician who cataloged the evidence, the drive had been marked and bagged the night of Caleb's arrest. It was there.
Documented.
Then gone. No one wanted to say the word, but Hastings could feel it crawling up the back of her neck. Sabotage. Someone inside the investigation was playing both sides. It wasn't just the missing evidence. Weird things started happening. Hastings got an anonymous envelope delivered to her office. No return address, no fingerprints. Just a grainy photograph of her 10-year-old daughter leaving school, paperclipped to a torn piece of notebook paper with 5 words scrawled in smudged ink. Stop digging or she pays. Security footage from the precinct had nothing. The envelope was slipped into the mail slot during a shift change, when the front desk had gone unmanned for less than 2 minutes. Hastings knew this wasn't just about Caleb anymore. Someone didn't want the truth to come out. And whoever it was, they were watching closely. At the same time, a new face entered the picture, Detective Miles Renner, transferred from a neighboring county, supposedly to assist with the overload of forensic analysis. But something about Renner didn't sit right with Hastings. He suggested they wrap this up before it dragged the department's name through the mud. Hastings had seen this kind of deflection before. In her gut, she didn't trust him. And when she ran his badge number through internal systems, something strange popped up. A sealed internal affairs case from 2 years ago. The details were locked, classified due to ongoing security concerns. No further explanation. Just another brick wall. He asked too many questions. Knew too much background about Caleb's case without having read the files. And more than once. Then came the revelation that upended everything. While combing through Caleb's online activity, a forensic analyst stumbled across a chat log embedded deep in the coding of a deleted Discord server. The messages were old, months before Caleb's confession. But what stood out was the other user. Their handle was EchoBox47, and their messages were laced with phrases that sounded eerily similar to what Caleb said during his confession. Almost too similar. Phrases like pain sharpens clarity, and to be seen is to be known, and to be known is to be punished. Hastings had heard those exact words from Caleb's mouth during the initial interview. Word for word. Had he been coached? Or worse, was someone else directing him? The IP address linked to EchoBox47 pinged from multiple locations. New York, Chicago, then Salt Lake City. Someone was masking their trail, using proxies, staying one step ahead. But the real bombshell came when a second analyst matched a phrase from those chats to an old university thesis, one written by Caleb's former psychology professor, Dr. Maren Lutz, a woman who had publicly distanced herself from Caleb after his arrest, who claimed to have no idea what he had become. But now, it looked like she may have had a much larger role in shaping him than anyone realized. Hastings requested to bring Dr. Lutz in for questioning, but her request was denied by none other than Detective Renner. He claimed she was under federal protection for an unrelated case and warned that pushing too hard might compromise an active intelligence operation. That was the moment Hastings realized she wasn't dealing with a simple murder case. This wasn't just about Caleb. It was about who made Caleb. Still, there was one more thread. A childhood incident buried deep in old family records, one no one had ever mentioned. When Caleb was just 8 years old, his name appeared in a Child Protective Services report linked to a suspicious injury at school. The report had been closed abruptly. No follow-up, no investigation. But one detail jumped out. The name of the social worker who signed off on the closure was Peter Martin, his own father. Now Hastings was staring down a case where the father may have buried abuse, the son had been manipulated by someone still at large, the lead detective might be compromised, and a witness with vital information had federal backing. And in the center of it all, a confession that was starting to look less like closure and more like a cover-up. But before Hastings could confront Peter about the CPS file, she arrived home to find her front door slightly ajar. Inside, nothing was taken. But on her kitchen table sat a single Polaroid photo of her sleeping in bed the night before. And on the back, one chilling word, scrawled in all caps. Remember. Something far more dangerous was unfolding. And the next piece of the puzzle wasn't Caleb. It was whoever was pulling the strings behind him. And they had just made their first move. Detective Laura Hastings stood frozen in her kitchen, staring at the Polaroid, its glossy surface catching the dim light, as if mocking her. Someone had been in her house. Not just outside, watching from a car or hiding in the bushes, but inside, watching her sleep, inches away from her. It wasn't just a threat anymore. It was personal. As she gripped the photo, the word remember echoed in her mind like a ghost from a past she didn't even realize she shared with Caleb Martin. And that's when the real curveball hit. Across town, at nearly the exact same time, another photo surfaced, this time not with Hastings, but with Amanda Chase, the younger sister of Caleb's high school best friend, Marcus. Amanda hadn't spoken to Caleb in years. In fact, most people forgot they were ever close. But as Hastings later discovered, Amanda and Caleb used to trade notebooks in middle school, filled with cryptic symbols, drawings of eyes, and phrases that, in hindsight, felt disturbingly prophetic. Amanda hadn't thought about those days in over a decade, until she opened her mailbox and found a notebook just like the ones they used to share. It was aged, worn, the pages crinkled at the edges like it had been through fire and water. Inside was a single drawing, a stick figure lying face down beneath a tree, a noose hanging from one of the branches, and scrawled in Caleb's unmistakable handwriting was a phrase that hadn't made sense to her at age 12, but now sent a chill through her bones. He won't stop until everyone forgets who they were. Amanda brought the notebook to the station in a panic, convinced someone was following her. Hastings knew the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. But here's where things started getting even stranger. Forensics tested the ink in the notebook and found that at least half of the writing had been laid down within the last 3 weeks. Caleb was in custody when it was written. So who had access to his old journals? And why was someone recreating pieces of his childhood? The deeper Hastings dug, the more it felt like she was chasing shadows. Amanda's brother Marcus, now a local contractor with no criminal record, initially denied having any recent contact with Caleb. But phone records showed otherwise. They spoke the night before Caleb turned himself in. And when confronted, Marcus broke. He said Caleb had reached out in desperation, claiming he was being used and needed to break free. Caleb allegedly told Marcus that they were watching him, and if he didn't follow instructions, his family would be next. Marcus never found out who they were, but he remembered Caleb's final words before the call abruptly ended. You were always the only one who knew how to hide the truth. Marcus refused to say what that meant, but his trembling hands and darting eyes told Hastings that he was sitting on a secret too dangerous to speak out loud. Then came the surveillance footage. Hastings pulled a week's worth of security videos from Caleb's neighborhood before his arrest, hoping to catch whoever might have been watching or following him. At first, nothing stood out. Same cars. Same routines. Then, 2 nights before the arrest, a black sedan parked across from Caleb's home. Lights off, engine running for 4 hours straight. No one got in. No one got out. When Hastings ran the plate through the system, she hit another wall. It was flagged under federal surveillance protocol, classified and untouchable. Not even a department-issued override could crack it. And just as the heat was building, a shocking twist rewrote everything they thought they knew. A set of audio recordings surfaced, discovered on a dusty cassette hidden behind a false panel in Peter Martin's old office at the family home. The tapes dated back nearly 2 decades, featuring therapy sessions between Peter and an unnamed child psychologist. The voice was unmistakably Peter's, but what he described sounded nothing like the warm, gentle father figure the public had seen during Caleb's trial. He spoke of intrusive thoughts, uncontrollable rage, and repeated references to the project. He said things like, "My son is the vessel. I am the architect, and once the memory is fractured, the narrative becomes moldable." Hastings listened to every word with increasing dread. What if Caleb wasn't born broken? What if someone had spent years engineering him to be this way? But before she could get the tapes to evidence lockup, they vanished. One moment they were in her locked desk drawer, the next gone without a trace. No break-in, no fingerprints, nothing on the cameras. The only thing left was a single sticky note taped to the inside of her desk. On it, in the same jagged handwriting as before, were the words, "This is bigger than him. It's bigger than you." Now, Hastings didn't just have a suspect. She had an entire network buried in shadows. A long-forgotten psychological experiment. A string of manipulated lives. And a town full of people who were either lying or too afraid to tell the truth. The walls were closing in, and every new discovery rewrote the story she thought she was telling. But the twist that turned her blood cold? It came late one night, when she ran a facial recognition scan on a blurred figure caught in a reflection in one of Caleb's old home videos. The system matched it with 89% certainty, not to anyone in Caleb's life, but to a former behavioral sciences professor who had disappeared without a trace 8 years ago. Declared dead. Body never found. The question now wasn't just what happened to Caleb Martin. It was who else had vanished in the making of this monster, and how many more were yet to come. Detective Laura Hastings wasn't easily shaken. Years on the force had taught her how to separate fear from instinct, paranoia from intuition. But something had shifted. It was no longer just a sense of unease. It was a storm swelling beneath her skin, a feeling she couldn't name but couldn't shake. The moment she discovered the professor's image buried in that old footage, a strange silence settled over her life. Friends stopped calling. The precinct grew colder, less welcoming. And the eyes, those cold, lingering stares she started noticing from cars idling just a second too long near her driveway, from strangers pretending to scroll their phones whenever she passed, were no longer ignorable. Someone was watching her. Not in the passive way Caleb had once described. This was deliberate, suffocating surveillance. She began waking in the middle of the night with the feeling someone had just left the room. Her front door would be locked, but the handle felt warm. Her cat refused to enter her bedroom anymore, sitting at the threshold with ears pinned back, eyes wide, tail flicking violently. Something was coming, and it wasn't subtle anymore. Then came the night she couldn't explain away. She returned home from the station well past midnight, exhausted and still haunted by what the forensics team failed to find. How could hours of security footage just vanish from the station servers without any trace? As she stepped into her home, she immediately sensed the air was wrong. Not cold,
Not warm.
just off. Like the entire house had inhaled but forgotten how to breathe out. Everything was exactly where she had left it, except for one thing. Her bedroom mirror, normally bolted to the wall, was lying face down on the floor. The screws weren't missing. They were lined up neatly on the nightstand. And drawn in thick red lipstick across the back of the mirror were 3 words. Tell no one. That was when Laura knew this case was no longer just about Caleb Martin. It was about her. She wasn't investigating the mystery anymore. She had become part of it. That night she packed a go bag, gun loaded, and drove to a motel outside of town. But even there, sleep was a memory she could no longer access. Her thoughts spiraled, tugged between Caleb's cryptic statements, the erased tapes, the professor's sudden reappearance in digital ghosts, and the whisper she had heard earlier that week while crossing her apartment hallway. It had been so faint she thought she imagined it, but now she could still hear it echoing in her skull. Memory is obedience. 2 days later, the danger took a darker turn. Her partner at the station, Detective Kyle Monroe, a man she had trusted with her life during countless raids and investigations, vanished. No phone calls. No texts. His apartment was locked from the inside, his car still in the lot. But inside, Hastings found a VHS tape resting on his pillow, labeled with the words, "You're next." She didn't play it. She couldn't. She handed it over to the tech team, but just like with the audio tapes, it mysteriously disappeared before analysis. The official report said Monroe was on leave due to family issues. But there was no leave form. No family issues. Just silence. Thick, terrifying silence. The kind that wraps around your chest and squeezes until your own heartbeat feels like a countdown. Hastings began to feel the lines between reality and manipulation blur. She started questioning not just the people around her, but her own thoughts. Her memory felt fractured. Conversations didn't line up with her notes. Files she swore she printed would vanish from her desk, only to show up in different folders with altered dates. And always, there was that name showing up in unexpected places. The architect. In graffiti outside a crime scene. In the margin of an old case file. whispered once in the background of a distorted 911 call that had nothing to do with Caleb Martin. She had no idea who the architect was, but she was starting to believe that he, or it, was orchestrating something far more intricate than a string of threats. This was a psychological web, each strand carefully woven to manipulate perception, fracture reality, and destroy trust. Every night she locked the doors. Every morning she checked for bugs in her car, but it never felt like enough. She had the growing sense that this wasn't about justice or solving a crime. It was about surviving a truth so large and dangerous, it couldn't be seen all at once. And yet she couldn't stop. Something inside her, pride, obsession, or maybe guilt, pushed her forward. But the question that haunted her most wasn't about Caleb or the professor or even Monroe's disappearance. It was this: what if the real reason Caleb confessed wasn't because of guilt, but because he was trying to warn her? And then came the message, slipped under her motel room door in the dead of night, scrawled in the same red ink as before. This time, no cryptic phrase, no veiled threat, just a single address and a date circled in thick black marker. The date was tomorrow. And the address? It was her childhood home, abandoned since her mother's death over 15 years ago. She hadn't stepped foot there in over a decade. But now it called to her, the way a buried memory surfaces when you're least ready. As she stared at the paper in her trembling hand, her phone buzzed. One new voicemail. No number. She put the phone to her ear and heard a familiar voice whisper one word. Her mother's voice, unmistakable, long dead, impossible to fake. Detective Hastings arrived at the crumbling remains of her childhood home just after dawn. The sky bruised with storm clouds, the air heavy with a silence that felt staged. Everything about that place was too still, like it had been waiting for her. The house sat crooked in the field like a secret too old to remember how to hide itself. Shutters barely clung to the sides. The grass out front had grown waist-high, and a broken swing swayed, without wind. The moment she stepped inside, a chill ran through her that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the sensation of being observed, deeply and without mercy. Dust floated through the air in slow, deliberate spirals, and somewhere deep in her gut, she knew she wasn't alone. This house had held more than memories. It had held truths she'd spent her entire life avoiding. As she made her way to the back room, the one that used to be sealed shut when she was a child, something about the floor creaked in an all-too-familiar pattern. Her fingers brushed over the door handle she used to be terrified of. Back then, she thought it was just where her mother kept old furniture. But now, standing before it with a loaded gun at her side and that torn slip of paper in her pocket, she knew better. She pushed the door open and found not dusty chairs or forgotten trunks, but a narrow staircase descending into pitch black. At the bottom of those stairs was a hidden basement she never knew existed. And what she found there shattered the foundation of everything she thought she was investigating. Rows of videotapes, labeled meticulously. Names she recognized, victims, suspects, even colleagues from the force. And there, at the front, one label in particular made her stomach lurch. Caleb Martin, trial run. She dropped to her knees, heart pounding as she slid the tape into the dusty player on the table. The screen flickered to life, and the grainy footage filled the room with a humming static. What she saw wasn't a confession, wasn't a breakdown. It was a script. Caleb, sitting in a room under harsh fluorescent lighting, reading from cue cards held off-screen by someone who never appeared in frame. A calm voice guided him. Pause. Look distraught. Now say the line about the voices. This wasn't a man losing his grip on reality. This was a man being trained to lose his grip. Or at least, to look like it. She felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The confessions, the disappearances, the vanishing evidence, it wasn't random. It was constructed. Fabricated.
But why?
And by who? Before she could process more, the tape clicked off and a second screen across the room lit up. A live feed. Her. Standing in the basement. Recorded in real time from a hidden camera mounted in the corner. She turned slowly, and there, in the reflection of the dark screen, she saw someone standing behind her. It wasn't a stranger. It was Captain Rowe. Her commanding officer. A man she'd trusted since her rookie days. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. "You were never supposed to see this," he said calmly, as if they were discussing budget reports. "But maybe it's time you understand. Caleb was part of something larger. A project. We chose him. Just like we chose you." Her voice cracked. "Chose me for what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. A thick file, the kind that felt heavier than it looked. "Everything you think is truth," he said, setting it on the table, "was built on selective memory. You're not solving a case, Hastings. You're following a map designed just for you." She flipped open the folder, fingers trembling, and the first page stopped her cold. It wasn't a report. It was a photograph. Of her. At age 12. Standing in that very basement. Staring directly into the lens. Behind her in the photo was her mother, and next to her, Caleb Martin. 15 years before he'd ever been arrested. 15 years before she thought she'd met him for the first time. She staggered back, clutching the photo like it might burn her. "That's not possible." But Captain Rowe only smiled. Not cruelly. Almost sadly. "You don't remember because we didn't let you. That's the cost of obedience. But you're starting to wake up now. And once the memories come back, there's no going back to the life you knew." As his footsteps faded up the stairs and the door slammed shut behind him, leaving her locked in that basement, the feed on the screen changed. Footage from another camera. Another person. Sitting in a room, much like Caleb's. But it wasn't a suspect. It was her. Present day. Being recorded in secret. Whispering something she didn't remember saying. "They told me if I don't play along, I'll disappear like the others." And suddenly, she realized she hadn't been the investigator at all. She'd been the subject. The pawn. And maybe, even worse, the experiment. Hastings stood frozen in the dim light of the basement, the silence pressing against her like a weight she couldn't lift. Every breath she took felt heavier than the last, clouded with a sickening blend of confusion and betrayal. The footage on the screen replayed her whispered words, words she had no memory of ever saying, over and over again like a looped nightmare. It was one thing to discover you'd been lied to. It was something else entirely to discover you might have been part of the lie. She stared at her younger self in the photograph, struggling to reconcile that blank stare with the person she had grown into, the person who had spent her life believing she was fighting for justice, not playing a part in someone else's scripted version of it. Her phone buzzed, a vibration so sharp it startled her out of the trance. No signal. But the message still came through. Just one line. "You have 1 hour. Meet me at the lake house." No name, no number. But she knew exactly who it was from. Her father. A man she hadn't spoken to in years. Not since the day he packed up and disappeared without a word. She'd convinced herself he was dead, or at the very least, lost to addiction and shame. But now, his sudden reappearance wasn't a coincidence. It was part of the game. The lake house was where it all began. Where her family used to go every summer before her mother's unexplained breakdown, before Caleb's name ever entered their lives. And now she had a choice. Go and risk walking straight into a trap, or stay and continue unraveling a truth that seemed designed to destroy her from the inside out. By the time she reached the lake house, the sun had fallen below the trees, casting the entire shoreline in a blue-gray dusk that made everything feel dreamlike and distant. The cabin looked untouched by time, but something about it felt wrong, like it was wearing the same mask she'd been forced to wear for years. Her father was waiting inside, sitting in the exact same armchair where she remembered him reading to her as a child. But the man who sat before her now was a ghost, leaner, older, eyes sunken from secrets he'd never meant to share. He didn't stand, didn't smile, just said, "You found the tapes." She didn't respond, just stared at him until he broke eye contact and looked down at his trembling hands. "I tried to protect you, God knows I did. But once you're in this, there's no clean way out. You weren't supposed to remember. That was the deal. But I guess the conditioning wore off." She felt the air vanish from her lungs. He reached into a drawer and pulled out another folder, thinner, older, edges curled with age. You were part of a behavioral trial. You were monitored,
Tested.
manipulated into becoming the perfect subject for a long-term memory erasure experiment. You and Caleb weren't strangers. You were both case studies.
What are you talking about?
What the hell did you let them do to me? I didn't let them. I didn't have a choice, he snapped, suddenly sharp. They threatened your mother, your future. They said if I didn't comply, they'd take you apart piece by piece and leave nothing behind. So I made the deal. We all did. Her fists clenched at her sides, rage boiling beneath her skin. What deal? You were kids playing together, then separated, conditioned, and placed back into society like nothing happened. You were never investigating Caleb, Elle. You were investigating yourself. She staggered backward, as if hit conditioning. Her world was crumbling faster than she could process, and now she was being told that even her most painful truths weren't hers. They were manufactured. She wanted to scream, to run, to hit something until it broke, but her father leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. There's more. They'll come for me once they know I've told you this. But they won't kill me until they get what they want. Which means I can still buy you time if you leave now. No, she said, shaking her head. You don't get to disappear again. You don't get to control the narrative one more time. I'm not trying to control it, he said quietly. I'm trying to save you. Then, he slid a burner phone across the table. There's a number on this. You call it and they'll offer you a choice. You give them the tapes, and they'll wipe everything. Again. Your memories, your past, your involvement. You'll go back to being Detective Hastings with a clean record and no nightmares.
Or.
She interrupted him, voice trembling. Or what? Or you keep digging. You expose them. You risk everything. Your job, your sanity, your life. But you'll know the truth. She stared down at the phone, heart pounding like it might explode. It was an impossible decision. If she called, she'd lose everything she had learned, but she could live in peace. If she didn't, she'd be hunted, her life dismantled piece by piece, but she'd finally know who she really was. And as the tension stretched, something outside caught her eye.
Movement.
A flicker of a figure slipping past the tree line. Watching. They weren't alone. Before she could react, her father stood, walked to the window, and with a calmness that chilled her to the bone whispered, "They're early." And just like that, everything collapsed into silence again. Not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that holds its breath right before chaos erupts. You said. The seconds felt like hours as Hastings locked eyes with her father, the eerie glow of the cabin's single overhead light casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the woods were no longer still. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sounded amplified, threatening. Whoever was watching them was close, too close. Her father backed away from the window, face pale, mouth set in a grim line. You need to leave, now. Take the back way through the boathouse. I'll hold them off. But Hastings didn't move. Her mind was racing, pounding with questions that refused to settle. The tapes, the false memories, the behavioral conditioning, it was all part of something much larger. And if what her father said was true, then none of this was about Caleb anymore. He had just been the bait. The entire investigation, the clues, the flash drives, the threats, it was a carefully engineered path meant to lead her here, to this moment. And now she was realizing she wasn't the only one walking it. She made her way out of the cabin's back in trance, adrenaline burning through her veins, her thoughts spiraling with every step. Just as she reached the dense trail that led toward the old boathouse, her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Another message. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a list of names. Names of people she knew, judges, officers, federal agents, people she'd worked with, admired, trusted. Some of them were dead. Some of them still had coffee with her every Monday morning. She stared in disbelief as her eyes fell on the last name on the list. Captain Rowan. He was her mentor. Her guide. Right before evidence got lost in transfer. Right before stories were rewritten to suit the agenda of people who controlled more than just the system, they controlled the narrative itself. She ran, ducking low beneath branches, feet pounding the muddy ground as the sound of pursuit grew louder. But her mind wasn't on escape anymore. It was on exposure. She knew now that if she didn't reveal the full truth, it would keep happening. More victims. More experiments. More lives turned into case files and clinical reports. She had to act, and fast. She had to get the list out. Reaching the boathouse, she slammed the door shut behind her and locked it. Inside, dust hung thick in the air. But in the far corner, behind a false panel in the wall, she found it, the backup her father mentioned. A second set of files, physical and digital. Documents, signed testimonies, old photographs. And in one of the folders, another twist she never saw coming, a profile.
Her own.
But not from childhood, from 2 months ago. It detailed her actions, reactions, notes on her investigation, and a prediction of how she would respond at each stage. The last line chilled her to her core, final phase expected within 48 hours. Subject may resist, but will comply once emotional tether is severed. And then it hit her. They weren't just tracking her. They were orchestrating her every move. Suddenly, she heard a voice behind her, one she recognized instantly. I told you to trust your gut, Elle. But you were too curious for your own good. Captain Rowan. He stepped into the dim light, gun holstered, badge gleaming. But his eyes told a different story, cold, calculating, unapologetic. You weren't supposed to get this far, he said, almost with admiration. But now that you have, well, I'm afraid your options are limited. And that's when she realized the truth wasn't just dangerous. It was fatal. The storm outside was unrelenting, drenching the world in chaos as thunder cracked like a war drum overhead. Inside the boathouse, everything slowed. Seconds dragged like hours, the silence between each word filled with dread. Detective Eliza Hastings stood across from Captain Rowan, her breath visible in the cold air, her hand clutching the folder that spelled out her fate in black and white. Rowan's calm demeanor never wavered, even as she read the files aloud, exposing the twisted operation he'd helped orchestrate. The program wasn't just about Caleb. It wasn't just about her. It was a decades-long psychological experiment funded by a black-budget intelligence branch, using generational trauma to test how far the human psyche could bend before it broke, and then to manipulate that fracture point. The flash drives, the anonymous threats, the murders, they were real, but they had all been part of a scripted unraveling. Eliza wasn't chasing a criminal. She was playing a role designed to trigger her own breakdown, all while being studied like a rat in a maze. Caleb, it turned out, had been just one of many like him, patients, pawns, people discarded when the experiment ran its course.
And Rowan?
He wasn't just part of the system. He was its architect. The smiling face that made sure everyone followed the script. The trusted ally who steered her down the path with every well-timed tip and encouraging word. Her voice shook as she asked the question that had haunted her for weeks. Why me? He didn't flinch. Because you were perfect. Smart enough to follow the trail, broken enough to doubt your own sanity, and damaged just enough to make it believable. Lightning flashed, illuminating his face for a brief, terrible moment, emotionless, detached, like a man who had long since stopped seeing people as human. She wanted to shoot him. Every part of her body screamed for justice, but something stopped her. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the realization that shooting him would only silence one head of a much larger beast. Either way, the standoff was broken when Rowan took a step forward and pressed a small device on his wrist. A mechanical click echoed from beneath the floorboards. You don't have time, Elle, he said quietly. You never did. But he underestimated her. While he'd been watching her actions, he hadn't counted on her emotions, her instinct, her refusal to break. She lunged for the cabinet beside her and yanked open a hidden compartment her father had once told her about in passing. Inside, an old emergency transmitter, pre-digital, analog, impossible to jam. She slammed her fist into the power switch and hit send. The signal would go out to every law enforcement and media outlet within a 100-mile radius, broadcasting every file, every name, every image from the hidden folder. It was over, or so she thought. Rowan's expression didn't change. He only smiled and said, Good. Now they'll know you were part of it too. Before she could speak, a second file appeared on the screen behind her. It was video security footage from weeks ago. It showed her at the hospital, in Caleb's room, whispering to him. At first, it looked innocent, but then the audio crackled to life. She wasn't comforting him. She was asking questions, directing him, testing his reactions. It looked clinical. She stared in horror. That's not what happened. Rowan stepped forward, his voice low and venomous. It's what they'll see. It's what they'll believe. She realized too late that the program had a final safeguard, a way to bury its secrets forever by discrediting the one person who could expose them. She hadn't just been manipulated. She had been framed. All along, every move she made had been recorded, twisted, and repurposed to make her look like a co-conspirator. In that moment, she understood the full horror. There was no way out. Not clean, not without consequence. But she could still choose how it ended. Rowan drew his weapon, slowly, as if giving her one last chance to back down. But Eliza didn't flinch. Instead, she reached for her recorder, still running, and turned the camera on him. Then let's finish this with the truth, she said. The screen went dark as a single gunshot echoed through the trees. And just when the viewers think it's over, the twist comes. In a final frame, back in the precinct, weeks later, an intern logs into an archived police server and finds a classified case marked "Do Not Open." The timestamp is from that night. Inside is raw, uncut footage. Eliza's voice, Rowan's confession, the real story. She hadn't sent just one signal. She had backed it up, hidden it, made sure that even if she fell, the truth would rise. And with one click, the intern hits upload. Everything begins again. The days that followed felt eerily still, like the world had taken a deep breath and forgotten how to exhale. Eliza Hastings stood at the edge of the shoreline, the early morning sun casting long shadows over the sand as waves lapped gently against her boots. The boathouse had been cordoned off, but inside, the echoes of that final confrontation still lingered, an invisible scar on a place already heavy with secrets. The video had gone public. Within hours, it exploded across social media, YouTube, and every major streaming platform, drawing millions into the dark web of truth she had uncovered. Keywords like government experiment, psychological manipulation, and corruption at the highest level trended nonstop. The world was watching, questioning, unraveling what they thought they knew. But the cost of that truth, for Eliza, had been everything. Her badge was gone. Her reputation left shredded in the court of public opinion, where perception outweighed reality. Some called her a whistleblower. Others called her a traitor. And yet, for the first time in her life, she felt strangely at peace. She never returned to the department. There were too many ghosts there, too many eyes that judged her without understanding the full story. Caleb, whose spiral into violence had ignited the fire, remained in a secure facility, quiet, distant, unreachable. No one knew what he'd become. No one was sure if he had been cured, if that was even possible, or if he was still lost somewhere in the maze built by other people's choices. But Eliza visited his mother once. She never spoke, just sat in silence across the porch with the woman who had unknowingly raised a son bred for chaos. They shared no words, just a fragile understanding, a mutual ache that needed no explanation. The federal task force promised justice, and a handful of arrests were made. Faces that once moved behind the scenes were suddenly front and center on news broadcasts. But the deeper players, the architects, the investors, the ones whose names were never supposed to be spoken, had long since vanished, disappeared into the cracks of the system that protected them. And while the world debated what was real and what was conspiracy, Eliza knew the truth was far worse than anyone dared admit. She'd only scratched the surface. The program may have been exposed, but its roots ran deep, tangled into every institution she once trusted. Her father's journal, found tucked in a secret compartment beneath her childhood floorboards, offered more than just closure. It revealed an earlier phase of the experiment, one that involved his generation. Her nightmares, her gut instincts, her obsession with uncovering the truth weren't just byproducts of trauma. They were symptoms of something planted in her long ago. She was part of the same system she fought to expose. And in that realization came the hardest truth of all. Some pieces of the puzzle would never fit because they were designed to keep spinning forever. But she had one final choice left. She handed over every document, every file, every audio recording to an independent journalist with nothing left to lose. Not for fame, not for redemption, but so that someone somewhere could carry the story forward. Eliza Hastings didn't want revenge. She wanted memory. She wanted the truth to live on longer than she ever could. And in that quiet sacrifice, she found something like freedom. As she walked away from the shoreline that morning, a faint buzz lit up her phone. An alert. A new video. It was grainy, timestamped the night before, showing an unmarked van pulling into a remote compound that hadn't been part of the investigation. Out stepped a man who looked far too much like Captain Rowan, alive, calm, untouched by the firestorm. She didn't react. She just stared, letting the cold wind whip across her face. The game was never over. It was just evolving. And she, for better or worse, had played her part. And so, as the screen fades to black, one final question hangs in the air for the viewers. If everything you believed could be manipulated, how would you ever know what's real? That's where this story ends, haunting, unresolved, and echoing in the minds of millions who now wonder if the rabbit hole ever truly ends, or if the fall just gets deeper. To forget.